The mountain did not care who she was. It did not care that she had already survived more than most soldiers would ever face. It did not care that German intelligence had distributed her photograph to every checkpoint in France with orders that made clear she was to be taken at any cost. It did not care that she was 36 years old, dressed in the rough clothes of a refugee, crossing one of the most treacherous winter passes in the Pyrenees on foot. It did not care that one of her legs was made of metal and wood. She climbed anyway, through the snow and the ice and the darkness, through the hours when her body screamed at her to stop, when the cold found every layer of clothing and settled into her bones. She climbed because the alternative was Klaus Barbie and a Gestapo interrogation room in Lyon, and she had made a decision somewhere far back down that mountain that there were things she would accept in this life and things she would not. She sent one last radio message before crossing the border. It was brief, practical, entirely her. Cuthbert is giving me trouble. Cuthbert was the name she had given her prosthetic leg. London radioed back, if Cuthbert causes too much trouble, have him eliminated. They did not know, and she, halfway up a mountain in the dark, laughed. Her name was Virginia Hall. The Gestapo called her the Limping Lady. Their most senior intelligence officers in France described her as the most dangerous Allied spy in all of occupied Europe. Klaus Barbie, who would become known to history as the Butcher of Lyon, dedicated considerable personal energy to finding her and failed. She wanted none of the credit. After the war, she refused public ceremonies. She preferred, she said, to work quietly. This is the story of a woman who changed the course of occupied France, one invisible move at a time. Virginia Hall was born in Baltimore in 1906 into a world that had very clear ideas about what a woman of her background was supposed to do with her life. She was educated, well-traveled, and intellectually restless in a way that made the expected path feel like a sentence. She studied at Radcliffe Barnard, and then in France, Germany, and Austria, absorbing languages the way other people absorb landscapes, almost without effort, certainly without forgetting. She wanted to be a diplomat. She wanted specifically to become a Foreign Service officer for the United States Department of State. She applied and passed the necessary examinations, and then the State Department found reasons to decline her application. Again and again. There were rules, written and unwritten, about women in those roles. The rules did not bend. She went to work as a consular clerk instead, a lesser position in American embassies across Europe. She was stationed in Turkey when the accident happened in the autumn of 1933. She was 27 years old. She was hunting with a group near the Turkish border, climbing over a fence when the shotgun she was carrying discharged. The wound was catastrophic. She was transporting to a hospital in considerable danger of her life. The doctors did what they could. It was not enough to save the leg. They amputated below the left knee. She was given a prosthetic made of wood and metal. She named it Cuthbert, the way someone names a thing they have decided to accept rather than resent. She learned to walk again, and then to walk without drawing attention, which is a different and considerably harder skill. She reapplied to the Foreign Service. They rejected her again. This time they cited a regulation that formally barred amputees from diplomatic positions. Virginia Hall was done asking. She was in Paris when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, and the world shifted on its axis. She drove ambulances for the French army during the chaotic weeks of the German advance. She watched France collapse with a clarity of eye that most people around her had not managed to achieve. When the armistice was signed and the occupation began, she was not surprised. She was already thinking about what came next. She went to England. And there, in the measured, serious offices of British intelligence, someone recognized immediately what was standing in front of them. The Special Operations Executive had been created by Churchill with a single instruction: set Europe ablaze. Its mandate was to insert agents into occupied countries, build resistance networks, disrupt German operations, and make the occupation expensive in every possible way. They needed people who could move invisibly in occupied territory, who spoke the language without accent, who could improvise under pressure and survive without backup, who had reasons of their own to be there. Virginia Hall had all of it. She was sent to France in August 1941. Her cover was a newspaper correspondent for the New York Post. She was based in Lyon, in the so-called Free Zone, the southern portion of France governed by the collaborationist Vichy regime. Lyon was one of the largest cities in France, a place of complex loyalties and underground networks, a city that was not yet under direct German occupation, but that was already dangerous enough. She went to work immediately and without the luxury of a gentle beginning. Within weeks, she had established contact with resistance groups, organized safe houses, identified reliable couriers, and begun the long, methodical process of building the infrastructure and intelligence network needs to survive. She helped Allied airmen and soldiers who had been separated from their units find routes south to neutral Spain. She identified people who could be trusted, and just as importantly, people who could not. She fed information back to London through coded radio transmissions. She recruited. She organized. She moved. She did all of this under cover identity, with forged papers, in a city where informants were everywhere, and the wrong conversation at the wrong moment could end everything. She was extraordinary at it. The people who worked with her during those years would later describe a woman of almost impossible nerve. Not reckless, she was precise, careful, deliberate in everything she did. But there was a quality of will in her that operated beyond what most people access. When something was necessary, she did it. When fear came, she set it aside. She understood the work and she did the work, and she did it for over a year before the noose began to tighten. Klaus Barbie arrived in Lyon in 1942. He was 30 years old, recently promoted, and extremely good at what he did, which was find people and break them. He made Virginia Hall his priority project. His agents spread her photograph across Lyon with instructions to watch the train stations, the cafes, the churches, the markets. They watched for a woman who walked with a slight irregularity, who might use a cane, who spoke French a little too precisely. She changed everything. Her hair, her clothes, her walk, the routes she took. The places she was seen. She was aware that every habit she had developed was now a potential liability, and she rebuilt her patterns from the ground up. But Lyon was becoming impossible. The German army occupied the Free Zone in November 1942. The distinction between the occupied North and the technically independent South disappeared overnight. Suddenly there were German soldiers at every checkpoint, German officers in the hotels, German intelligence agents in conversations that had previously been private. The world she had learned to navigate changed completely in 48 hours. She needed to get out. The way out was over the Pyrenees, through the high mountain passes into Spain in the middle of winter. There was no other option. Every other route was closed or watched. She found a guide. She found a small group of people making the same crossing. And in the darkness of a winter night she began climbing. The cold on those passes is a living thing. It takes fingers and then hands. It makes the ground uncertain and the body slow. It demands from every person who crosses it a negotiation with their own limits, a willingness to reach inside and find something, some reserve, some source that carries them past the point where the ordinary self would stop. Virginia Hall climbed with a prosthetic leg, on icy ground in the dark, and she did not stop. She made it to Spain. Spanish authorities, who had their own complicated relationship with the various powers fighting across their borders, arrested her briefly before she was able to make contact with Allied representatives and secure her release. She made it to London by January 1943. She was exhausted, thinner than she had been, and immediately looking for a way back. This is worth pausing on for a moment. She had spent over a year in occupied France under constant danger. She had just crossed a winter mountain range on a prosthetic leg to escape a Gestapo manhunt. Most people arriving in London at that moment would have felt that they had given what could reasonably be asked of them. Virginia Hall was angry that London wanted her to rest. The Special Operations Executive had a policy. She was now known. The Gestapo had her face, her name, her description. Sending her back into France was, by any calculation, extremely dangerous. They hesitated. She did not hesitate. She went to the Americans, the Office of Strategic Services, the American Intelligence Organization. The forerunner of the CIA was in the early stages of building its own networks in France. They were less encumbered by caution than the British had become about her specifically. They said yes. She trained with the OSS. And then in the spring of 1944, weeks before D-Day, she was sent back to France. This time she went as a different person entirely. She dyed her hair. She wore the clothes of an elderly French peasant woman. She changed her posture, her gait, her mannerisms. She transformed herself into someone that no Gestapo agent looking for a 38-year-old American intelligence operative would pause to examine. She operated in the rural Haute-Loire region, in the scattered farms and villages of central France, where she was known locally as Marie Monin. An old woman who kept goats and minded her business. Hall had spent years preparing began to move. Her Maquis units went into action. They cut telephone and telegraph lines across the region, isolating German units from their command structures at exactly the moment when communication was critical. They attacked German patrols and convoys, forcing the occupiers to defend supply lines rather than reinforce the front. They gathered intelligence on troop movements and transmitted it to London, where it fed directly into operational planning. The German army in central France found itself fighting shadows. Ambushes from people who knew the terrain perfectly and vanished immediately afterward. Communication lines that went dead without warning. Movements that were somehow anticipated before they were completed. Virginia Hall knew the terrain. She had learned it walking it as an old woman with goats, in the early mornings, in the rain, over months of careful observation. Paris was liberated in August 1944. Germany surrendered in May 1945, the war in Europe was over. Virginia Hall was 39 years old. She had spent 4 years in occupied France, on a prosthetic leg under false identities, hunted by the most capable intelligence apparatus in Europe, and she had survived every moment of it. More than survived, she had helped turn the tide. General William Donovan, the head of the OSS, flew to France personally to present her with the Distinguished Service Cross. It is the second highest military decoration in the United States, and she was the only civilian woman to receive it during World War II. He offered her a public ceremony. She declined. Quietly, privately, in the way she had always preferred to work, she accepted the medal. She joined the CIA when it was formed, and she worked there for the rest of her career, operating in the same anonymous fashion, building networks, handling intelligence, doing the kind of work that never appears in official histories. She retired in 1966. She lived quietly in Maryland with her husband Paul Goylot, a French-born OSS officer she had met during the war. She died in 1982. For decades, most people had never heard of her. That is precisely the way she would have wanted it, but her story does not belong only to her. It belongs to the long tradition of people who faced impossible circumstances and found, somewhere inside themselves, a quality of commitment that could not be defeated by cold or by fear or by mountains or by bureaucracy or by the considerable machinery of an occupying power determined to find her. She was told, in the polished offices of the State Department, that she was not what a diplomat looked like. She was told after a hunting accident in Turkey that she was not suited for the work she had chosen. She was told after escaping over the Pyrenees that she had done enough, that going back was too dangerous, that the prudent thing was to rest. She answered every one of those judgments the same way, quietly, without argument, with action. The Gestapo called her the limping lady, as if the leg were the most relevant thing about her, as if it were the fact that defined the limit of what she could do. They assembled files on her and distributed photographs and placed agents at train stations, and spent the productive years of the war's most brutal phase trying to find a woman who had already decided, long before any of them heard her name, that the things they represented and the world they were building were things she would spend her life resisting. They were looking for her limitations. They were looking in entirely the wrong direction. Virginia Hall crossed the Pyrenees in winter on a prosthetic leg, transmitted classified intelligence from a farmhouse while disguised as an elderly peasant, organized the networks that made D-Day marginally less costly, and then went home and refused a public ceremony and got quietly back to work. She did not do any of it to be remembered. She did it because it was necessary, because someone had to, and because she had looked at what the world was becoming and made a decision from which she never once flinched. Some people bend under the weight of what history asks of them. Virginia Hall looked history in the eye, named her prosthetic leg after a medieval English saint, and climbed the mountain.